Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. U.S. President Donald Trump has declared a national emergency, insisting he needs funds to build his promised border wall with Mexico. The unprecedented move has divided lawmakers, even within Trump's Republican Party, who say this is a misuse of presidential powers. Legal challenges have already been filed by Democrats and others. At issue for Trump is the need to protect the homeland from what he calls invaders from Mexico. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Professor Maurizio Ambrosini, who is a professor of sociology of migration at the University of Milan. He's also a scientific advisor at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. Maurizio, thank you for joining us here in the Scope. What are your thoughts about Donald Trump's insistence on the border wall?
Good afternoon. I think that this decision is an example of symbolic politics. To imagine a national threat about the possibility of entrance of people, in general, humble workers from the borders with Mexico. The data that have been made public say that irregular immigration in the United States has fallen down in the last years. And the majority of irregular migrants do not enter crossing the border, but they enter in other ways, with legal visas, for instance, as tourists. Furthermore, the majority of irregular migrants are not anymore Mexicans, but they come from other countries, from Asia, for instance. So there is a disconnection between the political message by the President Trump and what we know about the reality of irregular migration in last years, and in particular the problem of border with Mexico. I also to notice that local communities are threatened by this decision, also from the United States side, because many towns trade and work with people coming from Mexico. So there are also local threats for these decisions.
Maurizio, I wonder, do you think a border wall anywhere in the world would keep any country safe? Because, many people talk about the fact that, there was a wall in Germany, for example, at one point in time in history. Do you think that border walls in general, as an expert on migration, keep out migrants?
I think that borders are clearly reinforced in last years, and there is a political demand of more restrictions about human mobility. This is true. But the walls have a symbolic meaning in general. They divide we and them, the civilized insider people, the citizens, and the barbarians outside. They create deep divisions between people, and in some ways they give a message to reassure citizens about the priorities of their needs, of their status, or their legal conditions, against the possibility that people coming from outside enter and in some way change the social order of the society. I think it is an effect of globalization. People in many countries have loosened parts of their security or their perspectives or their economic conditions because of economic globalization. And governments try to reassure them, saying, but we are defending them against the invasion by these external invaders.
We could use even Italy as an example, Maurizio, about, its policies towards migrants and others. Why do you think these governments are taking such a harsh stance against migrants? Do you think that is actually keeping, for example, in Italy's case, Italians safer?
Yes, clearly, I think mainly to my country saying this about migration, security, and politics. I think that the first reason because government take such an attitude is the political interest. They notice that people like this type of message. They have voted for parties that give a strong priority to the defense of borders, to the exclusion of migrants, to the rejection of asylum seekers. And my country is a clear example of this. The present government has been formed by political forces very different between them, but with a common position on the exclusion of asylum seekers from the society, about the closure of ports, about the restriction of the possibility to receive a legal status as refugees in Italy. So I think in this moment, people, the majority of people, think that this is a priority of politics, and the security of the country is better given by this closure against migrants. Clearly, it is not true, but the political message in this moment is winning on this ground.
All right, Maurizio, I know that you have a busy schedule today, so we'll leave that as your final word. But of course, we appreciate you taking your time out to speak to us here in the scope, and we, of course, to have you on in the future. Again, that was Maurizio Ambrosini, Professor of Sociology of Migration at the University of Milan, and he's also a scientific advisor to the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. He was speaking to us from Milan there in Italy. We'll be right back after a short break with the rest of the segment. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us, viewers, here in The Scope as we continue to discuss Donald Trump's decision vis-a-vis a national emergency over what he desires to become a border wall between the United States and Mexico. To discuss that further, we're now joined by Dr. Rasul Bakhsh, who is a political analyst. He's also professor at the LUMS University right here in Lahore. Dr. Rais, as always, thank you for joining us here in The Scope. What do you make of Donald Trump's decision vis-a-vis this national emergency, his insistence on this border wall?
I think this is what he has been saying for a very long time. There has been resistance against his determination to build a wall between the two countries, where across the borders people who speak Spanish language live, and Texas and California and some other states were part of the Spanish Empire. And when Spain ceded these territories to the United States as a result of war, populations remained there, but then there was internal migration, and there are mixed populations. People are bilingual, and across the border, people have been coming to the United States, and they have sustained particularly agricultural growth and construction industry for a very long time, because it was a cheap labor available to them. But then, because of changing times, economic pressures, Donald Trump has used fears of the white majority in Texas in particular, in these states, and his narrative has been that the immigrants are criminals. They are drug traffickers, and they are going to take over our jobs, and they cannot be welcome. And I think there is a constituency within the white population in Midwestern states, in southern states, which he has exploited for political reasons.
I ask you, Dr. Rais, about this narrative, as you had spoken about as well, that's been created in the minds of Americans about immigrants in general, specifically, of course, those coming from Latin America. Do you think that Americans do not appreciate the fact that immigrants are the ones that really have helped build America to where it is today?
Yes, but the times have changed. I think there is a recognition of the role of the immigrant, particularly qualified workers, and there were times when Chinese built the railroads in Western states. Immigrants have played, and migration has played a great role in American industrial development and revolution. But now times have changed. Today, the populist narrative in Europe and the United States is against migration, and I think it syncs very well with right-wing majorities within the white population in the United States. A fear that over time the whites in some of these states will become a minority, and that has worked very well. And if you look at the nature of politics, politicians would say and do things that will get them elected. And I think that is a position that seems to be at the center of Donald Trump's campaign for re-election. So he has started quite early on the same theme that he had back 2 or 3 years back. And now it is the same thing that he is saying, because he has been advised, and probably it is his own assessment or that of his close associates, that this is the theme that is going to get him re-elected.
Okay, so let me add another voice to this conversation. We're now joined by Mr. Shuja Nawaz, who is a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. Mr. Nawaz, as always, we appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule and sharing your thoughts with us here in The Scope. Mr. Nawaz, what do you make of Donald Trump's decision to declare this national emergency? Obviously, a lot of talk that we can, I'm sure, bring up about what this means constitutionally, etc. But what message is this sending, do you think?
Well, the message is one that he's been sending for the last 2 years, which is that there is no clear policy coming out of the White House. It is all whimsical. He is now turning on his own Republican Party and on the outgoing speaker, among others, and he is going back to his base, which he has a strong hold on, and he's also going to use this opportunity to put those members of the Senate and the House on notice who oppose him, that if he opposes them in their primaries leading up to the next election in 2020, when many of the senators from the Republican side are going to be up for re-election, that he can actually harm their chances. He's proven that before with Mark Sanford of South Carolina, and he's going to use that threat to strengthen his base and prepare to win back the White House in 2020.
So in some ways, Mr. Nawaz, do you think that we're going to see a more divided America going ahead? Because this has really, brought forth a lot of anger, even on the part of some Republicans.
Absolutely. This has been the hallmark of the Trump presidency, division and falling back on the base, because there is no way that he can change his stripes or his performance to win the majority of Americans. It is to his advantage to have a divided country and a divided electorate so that he can then pick and choose his opponents and knock them off one by one.
Dr. Rais, what do you make of that then? A divided America, this time on this issue, of course, of migration from the border over Mexico. What does that mean for you, and how dangerous really is that for America and the region?
I don't think it is going to be dangerous for the United States. It is going to be a divided polity, as it seems it has been. Donald Trump himself is a polarizing figure, and this narrative has created sharp divisions within American media, intellectual circles, and politics is going to be a hard game. But the danger is that if a superpower of our time takes this position on migration, then it is going to have vibrations in in European countries. And they are going to be very tough on migrants from developing countries, third world countries. So I don't think that this right-wing wave within the United States, which is going to create similar wave elsewhere, is going to be good for globalization, for people moving from one country to another. Things are not going to be easier, particularly for people from subcontinent. Qualified skilled workers that have been going and settling there. So I think that also at ground level within the society we are going to see racist attitude towards non-whites.
Okay, I'm going to give the final word for this topic to Mr. Nawaz. Mr. Nawaz, what do you make of the fact that, as Dr. Rais there said, we are in fact seeing many European countries as well, the populist wave there as well, the anti-immigrant feeling that is growing in Europe as well. This seems to be something that, Europe is taking lesson from the United States, or vice versa, really. What do you make of that entire anti-immigrant issue?
It's not just the anti-immigrant issue. I think there's a much more fundamental problem in the U.S. Political leadership emanating from the White House, and that is the lack of institutional decision-making.
Okay.
You can't have the United States as what I would call a global Gulliver wreaking havoc across the global landscape. You need to be consistent in what you're saying and doing, rather than creating chaos and disruption in order to achieve your ends. President Trump, unfortunately, has shown an inability to take briefings, to understand complex issues. He rejects the views of his own confidants, his own experts, whether in the White House, in state, or in the Department of Defense, and makes his own decisions at short notice. So this kind of zigzagging creates chaos on the international scene, where you need a steady hand, and you need a steady direction. And that is, I think, the loss to the whole world, which is going to be very costly in terms of the economy as well as politics.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final word, but of course we appreciate all of the analysis and insight that our guests have brought to this discussion. Let me thank them from the bottom there. We were joined right there at the end by Mr. Shuja Nawaz, Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council. We were also joined by Dr. Rasul Bakhsh Rais. He's a professor at Lums University right here in Lahore. And we were also joined earlier from Milan by Professor Maurizio Ambrosini, who's a senior advisor to the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. Now, viewers, as all of our guests spoke about this issue of this national emergency that Trump has declared about this border wall, which he wants to build between Mexico and the United States, is one which really polarizes American society. His base seemingly does agree with him about the need for a border wall, the need to stem all sorts of illegal immigration over that border with Mexico. What does that mean globally? Of course, we know that there are governments in Europe which seem to be taking lesson from that. And as Mr. Nawaz there said at the end, this also goes to show the fact that Trump does not listen to even his own advisors. We'll keep a very close eye on how that situation develops there in the United States. Don't go anywhere, though. I'll be back with our next segment after this short break. Viewers, thank you for staying with us here in The Scope. In this segment, we're going to discuss Pakistani Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi, who has met the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani on the sidelines of a security conference in Munich. This is at a time that reports have once again surfaced of Pakistan being the venue of the next talks seeking to forward the Afghan peace process. The Afghan government has insisted its involvement is vital to any lasting solution with the Taliban. To discuss that further, we're now joined first by Mr. Ahmed Rashid, who is an analyst, and he's joining us from right here in Lahore. He's a journalist and best-selling foreign policy author of several books about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. Mr. Rashid, thanks for joining us here in The Scope. What are your thoughts about where we're at in the Afghan peace process? Certainly it is important, isn't it, to bring the Afghan government now to the table?
Well, certainly it is time, and I think one of the resentments in Kabul against Pakistan is based on the simple fact that President Ghani does not feel that Pakistan has done enough to persuade the Taliban to start talking to the Kabul government. And he also suspects that the Americans, and particularly the U.S. envoy, Zalmay Khalilzad, has not done enough either. On the Pakistani side, there's a resentment, I think, that President Ghani is expecting too much too soon, and that it's going to take time. The U.S. Taliban talks have to come to some sort of conclusion before the Taliban are going to be willing to meet with the Kabul government.
On that point, then, do you think that overall, though, the narrative about Pakistan's influence or lack of, as it may argue, it has been overstated? Do you think sometimes?
I think the tension between President Ghani and the Pakistani authorities has been long running. It's not going to go away in a hurry, and I think we have to see more progress in the talks. Remember that so far we don't have any concrete agreement, even between the Taliban and the Americans. So I still think there's some way away yet. There will be more talks between the Americans and the Taliban. They will have to come to some kind of agreement, and only then will the Taliban, move towards opening a dialogue with Kabul. So President Ghani has to be patient also.
But I imagine, then if that is the case, if you described it, about the mistrust that exists right now, then I imagine even a small meeting of just a few minutes, if that's what it was, on the sidelines of this conference in Munich between the Pakistani foreign minister and Afghan president would be quite significant, wouldn't it, then at this point, especially considering Pakistan is to be the venue of these next talks vis-a-vis the Afghan peace process?
Yes, well, Mr. Khalilzad is also there. So the fact is that the Pakistani, the Afghans, and the Americans are all at the Munich conference, and it's an important conference. That the NATO chief is there as well. So far, all we've heard about the next round being held in Pakistan is from the Pakistanis. The Americans are saying that they have not received any invitation and they have not received any notification about this, and they are waiting. As far as I know, they're still waiting for some official indication. The Americans also have to be very careful that they don't annoy President Ghani. President Ghani is quite volatile, and he has been, he has been known to be very impatient, and there is a question of mistrust also between Ghani and the Americans. So we're entering now a very complicated phase in order to get agreement between the Taliban and the Americans on this question of the withdrawal of U.S. troops and the Taliban conceding a ceasefire and exchange of prisoners.
Right. So let's talk then, if we may, for a moment about Zalmay Khalilzad himself. How do you view his performance so far? It could be argued that as somebody who should be a negotiator / mediator, he may have made a misstep by criticizing the Taliban as he did, that time during this process. Do you think that he did make a misstep there, misspoke possibly, or just made a mistake really, and that may have hurt the process?
Well, I think one of the problems with Khalilzad is that he's got a very long history in Afghanistan. He's, of course, Afghan-born himself. He's been very prominent since the 1980s with the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. He was working in the Reagan administration, and then, of course, in the Bush administration after 9/11. So one advantage is that he knows everyone. He's in some circles, he's very popular also in Afghanistan, because he took when he was ambassador in Kabul after 9/11, U.S. ambassador, he took a strong line against Pakistan, which deeply annoyed the Pakistanis, but made him some friends in Kabul. Now, of course, he has to play a much more balanced role he has to juggle between President Ghani and even other players like the Russians and the Saudis, etc. So, so far, I think given the very complex situation that exists, he hasn't done too badly. And it seems that the Pakistanis who did not trust him in the beginning seem to have built up some kind of trust with him and working relationship with him. And he's been very upfront this time to praise Pakistan for its help and cooperation in bringing Taliban to the table.
Right. So then, we also know about this issue, as you mentioned in an earlier answer, about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. Obviously, that's one of the key demands of the Taliban. We originally, of course, had that announcement by, I believe it was Donald Trump himself, where it said that half of U.S. forces would withdraw. The Pentagon at that time had said, we haven't gotten any such order. Do you think the U.S. is really willing to walk away from Afghanistan in the manner that the Taliban would want?
I don't think the U.S. is going to completely abandon Afghanistan. I still think that there will be several thousand American NATO troops there, even after an agreement, and this is something the Taliban will accept. And even the withdrawal is not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen, I think, over quite a long period of time. Remember, the Americans don't have that many troops. It's only about 14,000. Compared to 100,000 that they had there during the Obama period. So it's not a huge amount of troops, and a lot of the complex technology that the Afghan army has been given can only be operated with the Americans, especially the Air Force, for example. So I think the Taliban are going to see, as long as there's a ceasefire between the Taliban and the Americans and the Afghan government forces, I think we're going to see a timetable for withdrawal which will be quite long and which will have to be accepted by all sides.
Because I know you have to go because you have a busy schedule today. I just wanted to ask you one final question, Mr. Rashid, and then about the Taliban itself. We still hear of course, Taliban attacks happening and vice versa, where Afghan forces are attacking the Taliban. That still continues. Then there's reports of course, of a Taliban control or not of areas throughout Afghanistan. All of that complicates things, doesn't it? Because those realities on the ground, I imagine, have an effect on any negotiations, right?
Well, certainly, we know that the Taliban, are controlling 50-60% of the countryside. They don't have total control over the cities, but certainly they control the main roads connecting the cities. And if they want to, they can step up their attacks against Afghan government forces who have not been able to retake a lot of the territory that they've lost. Now, all this, I hope, will come to an end very soon. One of the first demands by all sides is, of course, a ceasefire.
Yeah.
And talks between the Taliban and Kabul and the Americans would benefit enormously if there was a ceasefire.
Very well, Mr. Rashid. We'll leave it there at that with you. But of course, we appreciate you taking your time to speak to us here in the scope. That was Mr. Ahmed Rashid, analyst, speaking to us live right here in Lahore on the line. Let me add another voice to this conversation. We're joined now by Mr. Imtiaz Gul, who is an analyst. He's joining us from Islamabad. He's executive director of the Center for Research and Security Studies. And Mr. Gul, as always, we appreciate you taking your time out to join us here in the scope. What do you make, Mr. Gul, of the current situation right now when it comes to this Afghan peace process? Our earlier guest talking about a complex situation now, really, with the Taliban still insisting that it will not talk to the Kabul government directly, though it seems that we're still somehow moving forward through this process.
I think Taliban are still talking from a maximalist position, and that is their reluctance or their refusal to talk to the Afghan government. But I think that they also know that in the end they shall have to sort the situation out by talking to the Afghan government, at least indirectly, because that is the endeavor right now, that the Americans, by talking to the Taliban, have to prepare the ground for an eventual intra-Afghan dialogue, which is the primary condition for reconciliation, for return of some semblance of peace in Afghanistan, and that the Taliban shall have to back down from their refusal of engaging with the National Unity Government and eventually agree to talk to them, because this is what Pakistan also desires, this is what other regional players also desire, and I think there's a grand consensus on the need for an Afghan-led, Afghan-agreed settlement mechanism, and that will not come about as long as the Taliban refuse to talk to the National Unity Government.
I'm glad you brought up, Pakistan and its role in all of this, because, and I know we've spoken about this in past shows as well, but how important do you think it is to remind everyone, and as I'm sure Pakistan would want to remind the world, that, listen, its influence over the Taliban has been overstated, really, that it cannot just order the Taliban around or order it to the negotiating table or not. Why do you think that narrative still very much exists?
Well, there are two different things. Influence, to the extent that one could talk directly or indirectly to one of the interlocutors and requesting them, nudging them towards talks. And the other thing is exercising pressure. Pressure doesn't work, particularly in the Afghan context. The Americans tried pressure on the Taliban, they tried pressure on Pakistan. This entire strategy of applying pressure and forcing the opponent into a position of weakness and softening them for talks, it basically failed, and eventually everybody had to come around the point that the only way forward is nudging and persuading, convincing the Taliban, a very reticent Taliban, to talk. So in this case, the Americans basically backed down from their stated position of not directly talking to the Taliban, and the Taliban eventually agreed to discuss peace and reconciliation directly with the Americans.
Yeah.
So I think this is the one thing that Pakistan has done, and that's why Pakistan has become the linchpin of the reconciliation process, that it does have influence, it does have long-standing relations with a number of Afghan leaders, and this is what it has deployed to persuade the Taliban to come on the table, and one would hope that this process continues with the facilitation of Pakistan, and particularly when the Afghan delegation comes in the next couple of days for a meeting, possible meeting with Prime Minister Imran Khan.
Yes, and I wanted to, in fact, bring up that meeting because there's been a lot of talk about that, of course. The Americans saying that right now they have not gotten an invitation to any such talks themselves, apparently. At least that's the reports that came out today. But in the middle of all of this, Mr. Gulden, we had this meeting that took place not too long ago in Moscow, where, you had Afghan opposition that met the Taliban representatives there. And then Russia later on saying, listen, this was not actually an official event of the Russian government. That's created sort of a confusing situation, isn't it? What did you make of that?
No, I don't think there's any confusion. The reality is that the Afghan government is indirectly somehow in contact with the Taliban. The Taliban agreed to listen to the speeches by Afghan members of parliament, including one lady, Fawzia Kofi, and other members of parliament. So the endeavor, I think the effort by the Russians was basically aimed at softening the stated positions by their respective interlocutors. And this basically was also to underscore the broad regional consensus on the need for a negotiated settlement involving the Taliban, who have not been defeated. I mean, there's also another stark, bitter reality, however unwanted it may be, that the Taliban have not been defeated, and the Taliban on the other side cannot hope to win militarily. So somehow everybody has to work for middle ground, for middle solution, and this is what I think Pakistan, Russia, China, and the United States are trying to achieve.
All right, we're going to thank Mr. Imtiaz Gul, analyst who is speaking to us from Islamabad. He's Executive Director of the Center for Research and Security Studies, who is speaking to us from the Pakistani capital. We're now joined by Ambassador Muhammad Ayaz Wazir, who is a former ambassador who has served at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs abroad in several global locations. We, of course, appreciate you taking your time out, Ambassador Wazir, to speak to us here in the scope. Ambassador Wazir, what do you make of where the Afghan peace process is at this point? There are some demands on the table, of course, by the Taliban for a complete withdrawal of U.S. forces. How likely is that to happen?
Well, I think there is hardly any doubt about it, because the Americans have said it after what the Taliban announced, that the Americans have agreed to completely withdraw from Afghanistan. Now the question is how that is to be done. The withdrawal is definitely agreed upon, and in return the Taliban had agreed that they will not allow the Afghan soil to be used against the American. So these two things are agreed upon, but obviously an agreement is not to be signed until the other nitty-gritties are also tightened up, particularly their talk with the Afghan government.
Yes.
Because without talking to the Afghan government, I don't think anything definite can be said, because the Afghan government also is a big stakeholder. It cannot just be sidelined or left outside of it. So
do you think, Ambassador Wazir, that there will be talks soon between the Afghan government and the Taliban? Because obviously everybody else wants this to be an intra-Afghan, an Afghan-led process.
Well, true, but the Taliban, I think, are giving the impression that since they have talked to the Afghan leaders in Moscow, who are representing quite a big circle or different groups of people, leaders were there to represent different people. So that can be another angle of looking at that. If the Afghan government is not there, the Taliban with all the other important stakeholders are there. But in my own assessment, if the Afghan government is not involved, then thinking that peace will return to Afghanistan would be just a wrong calculation. So to bring peace to Afghanistan or to make the whole region peaceful, we need to have all the Afghan important stakeholders, including the Afghan government, agreed upon this talk that is going on between the Taliban and the American, and then the Taliban and the Afghan government. If that happens to, like you said, everybody thinks so, but the Taliban are right now a bit reluctant to talk to the Afghan government, because they think the Afghan government is a puppet government that was installed by the American after removing the Taliban.
Right.
Now the American have recognized the Taliban's strength, and the Taliban think that they are coming back to their original position of taking over Afghanistan. So there is quite a big difference in the proposal that the Taliban should talk to the Afghan government.
Right.
But as I said, without talking to the Afghan government, in my assessment, peace is obviously then anybody's guess.
All right, Ambassador Wazir, we'll leave that as our final word, but of course we appreciate you taking your time out of a busy schedule to share your thoughts with us on this important topic. That was Ambassador Muhammad Ayaz Wazir, former ambassador, and he's served at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs globally in several locations. He was speaking to us from Islamabad. As I said, viewers, we also had Mr. Imtiaz Gul earlier, who is an analyst who was speaking to us from Islamabad. We had Mr. Ahmed Rashid, analyst, speaking to us from right here in Lahore as well, and he had shared his thoughts with us as well on this important topic. Now, of course, this meeting between Pakistan's Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi as well as the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani on the sidelines of that conference, the security conference in Munich, was an important one. And of course, going forward, we know that there will be some sort of talks in Pakistan. Seemingly at this point, though, there seem to be some details that need to be worked out about that, at least from what we're understanding through media reports. Behind the scenes, things may be a lot more confirmed. At this time, of course, there are the demands of the Taliban on the table: withdrawal of U.S. forces, promise to never use Afghanistan against other nations, etc. They still insist not to talk to the Afghan government, and that, of course, remains a very big hurdle at this point in time before moving forward. We'll keep a close eye, of course, on that peace process as it plays out, but we'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi, and this has been Scope.